In the fall of 1911, the St. Jude's Orphan train, carrying 77 children toward new lives, vanished without a trace in the vast plains of Kansas. 100 years later, the demolition of a historic mansion would uncover a time capsule containing a diary. Its final entries revealed the train's disappearance was no accident, but the first step in a meticulously planned conspiracy that condemned every soul aboard to build a town on a foundation of their bones. Where are you reading us from? Share your city and country in the comments before we continue this story. The journey began as a passage of hope. The steam engine chugged westward, its cars filled with children plucked from the crowded tenements and unforgiving streets of New York City. For them, the vast, unending sky of the American heartland was a canvas for new beginnings. They were promised families, open spaces, and a future untethered from the poverty of their birth. Each turn of the wheels brought them closer to a life they could only have imagined in their wildest dreams. Among their guardians was Sister Agnes, a young nun whose faith was as bright as the prairie sunflowers. She moved through the aisles with a gentle smile, offering comfort and chronicling their progress in a small, leather-bound diary. Her entries were filled with optimistic sketches of the children, their laughter, their wide-eyed wonder at the passing buffalo, their quiet hopes whispered in the dark. To her, this train was not merely transport, it was a sacred vessel carrying precious souls toward salvation. The children themselves were a mosaic of resilience. They ranged in age from toddlers, barely old enough to understand their plight, to teenagers on the cusp of adulthood, their faces etched with a premature world weariness. They had been told this journey was their chance to escape the fate of their parents. In the rhythmic clatter of the train on the tracks, they heard the sound of a future being forged, a promise of belonging in a world that had so far cast them aside. Their final scheduled stop was meant to be a brief resupply in the burgeoning township of Prosperity, Kansas. The town was a testament to the ambition of its founder, the charismatic industrialist Jedediah Kane. It was presented as a model community, built on the principles of hard work and righteous fortune. For the tired travelers, Prosperity was to be a fleeting glimpse of the very stability and success they were journeying west to find. A final pause before their new lives began. Jedediah Kane was a figure of immense local prestige, a man who had seemingly carved a modern Eden from the unforgiving prairie. He spoke of progress and destiny, and the town of Prosperity was his monument. His newly established silver mine was the engine of his wealth, a source of employment and pride for the region. The townspeople saw him as a visionary patriarch, a leader whose ambition was matched only by his public displays of piety and community spirit. Official railway logs, preserved for a century, documented the St. Jude's train's final known movements with chilling precision. The records show it was seen switching from the main line onto a private spur. This particular track was newly laid and served a single purpose: to connect the main railway with Jedediah Kane's silver mine, located several miles from the heart of town. It was a deviation from their planned route, but no one at the time questioned the logistics of a powerful man. Then the sky broke open. A severe thunderstorm of historic proportions descended upon the region, a meteorological anomaly that would be spoken about for generations. The sky turned a bruised purple, and rain fell in blinding sheets, transforming the dusty plains into a sea of mud. The Cimarron River, usually a docile ribbon of water, swelled into a raging torrent, its currents powerful enough to uproot ancient cottonwood trees and reshape the very landscape in its fury. When the train failed to arrive at its next scheduled station down the line, a quiet concern grew into a palpable alarm. Telegraph lines buzzed with inquiries, but the storm had severed communication with the remote stretch of track where the train was last seen. As hours turned into a full day, search parties were dispatched from neighboring towns, their progress hampered by the flooded terrain and the relentless driving rain. The hope that had filled the train was now replaced by a growing dread. The searchers eventually made a grim discovery that seemed to provide a definitive, tragic answer. The main railway bridge spanning the Cimarron River had been completely destroyed, its timber supports shattered, and its steel tracks twisted into grotesque shapes. The floodwaters had washed it away entirely. The evidence was overwhelming and pointed to a single, horrific conclusion. The search for survivors slowly, grimly, transitioned into a search for wreckage that would never be found. The conclusion was immediate and unanimous among the authorities and the public. The Orphan train had been on or near the bridge when it collapsed. The powerful current, they surmised, had swept the entire train, its engine, its cars, and every one of its 77 young passengers and their caretakers miles downstream. The river, they said, had become their tomb, burying them forever beneath tons of shifting silt and debris, a permanent grave from which there could be no recovery. The town of Prosperity, led by a publicly grieving Jedediah Kane, became the center of the nation's sympathy. Kane himself delivered a powerful eulogy, his voice thick with emotion, as he lamented the loss of so much promise. He pledged to build a memorial, a permanent marker to ensure the lost children would never be forgotten. His performance was masterful, cementing his image as a compassionate leader struck by an unspeakable tragedy that had occurred on his very doorstep. An official inquiry was conducted, but it served only to ratify the accepted narrative. It was declared a tragic act of God, an unavoidable catastrophe caused by the unprecedented force of the storm. Without a single piece of wreckage or a body to examine, there was no other evidence to consider. The case of the St. Jude's Orphan train was officially closed, its file stamped with the cold finality of an accident for which no living person could be blamed. The memorial was erected in Prosperity's town square, a stone angel with downcast eyes, its base inscribed with the words, "To the lost children of St. Jude's taken by the river, remembered in our hearts." It became a landmark, a place for somber reflection. The town's identity became intertwined with this sorrowful event, its founding myth cemented not just by Kane's ambition, but by a shared noble grief for the innocents who had perished so near their gates. Over the decades, the story solidified into a somber local legend. It was a ghost story whispered to quiet, unruly children, a cautionary tale about the unforgiving power of nature. The vanished train became a phantom, its whistle sometimes imagined on the wind during autumn storms. The 77 children were rendered nameless, faceless symbols of lost innocence, their individual stories and dreams erased by the single, sweeping narrative of the flood. The passage of time worked like a shroud, covering the event in layers of folklore and accepted history. Generations were born and raised in Prosperity, learning the tale of the Orphan train as a foundational piece of their town's heritage. The Cimarron River, long since returned to its placid state, held its secrets silently. The raw wound of the tragedy healed into a scar of collective memory, a sad story told about a time long past. No one questioned the official account. There was no reason to. The evidence of the destroyed bridge was irrefutable, and the storm had been witnessed by hundreds. The absence of wreckage was explained away by the river's sheer power. The narrative was simple, complete, and emotionally resonant. It offered a clear, albeit heartbreaking, explanation for how a train filled with children could simply cease to exist in the middle of the American plains. The parents who had given up their children, and the distant relatives who may have waited for them, were left with nothing but the official report. Their letters of inquiry eventually stopped. The St. Jude's Orphanage in New York, after years of mourning, eventually closed its doors. The world moved on, and the 77 children were relegated to a footnote in the history of the orphan train movement, its single greatest and most mysterious disaster. The town of Prosperity thrived, its silver mine producing a surprising, albeit short-lived boom in the 2 years immediately following the tragedy. Jedediah Kane's fortune grew, and his legacy as the town's benevolent founder was carved in stone. His descendants became the town's most prominent family, their status built upon the wealth he had amassed. The story of the lost children became a part of their family history, a sad prelude to their enduring success. For 100 years, the earth kept its silence. The dynamited entrance to the old Kane mine was overgrown with prairie grass, forgotten by all but the most detailed maps. The town of Prosperity celebrated its centennial, its pristine image polished and proudly displayed. The story of the train was retold with solemn reverence, a testament to the community's ability to endure and remember a great tragedy that had occurred at its founding. The children were ghosts, their futures stolen, and their true fate unknown. They existed only as a collective noun, the lost orphans. Their names, their faces, and the truth of their final hours were believed to be irrecoverable, washed away and buried by the relentless flow of the river and the even more relentless passage of time. The case was not just closed, it was considered an immutable fact of history, but the official record was a carefully constructed lie. The community's shared grief was built on a foundation of deceit. The stone angel in the town square did not commemorate an accident. It stood as a monument to a monstrous crime. The truth had not been swept away by a river, but had been deliberately entombed, locked away in darkness, deep beneath the ground, waiting for a century. The story was accepted as a tragic act of God, a chapter closed forever. No one ever thought to look for the children anywhere but in the silt of the Cimarron River. It never occurred to anyone that their final destination was not a watery grave, but the suffocating darkness of the very mine that had promised Prosperity its future. Who could have possibly benefited from such an elaborate and monstrous deception? The answer lay buried not in the riverbed, but within the walls of the Kane estate itself, preserved in the frantic, terrified handwriting of the only witness who had lived long enough to write it down. The truth was waiting for the sound of a demolition crew ready to shatter a century of silence. The year is 2011. A century has passed, and the town of Prosperity, Kansas, prepares to commemorate its most defining tragedy. The centennial celebration is planned around the solemn memorial of the angel, a testament to the town's enduring grief for the lost children of the St. Jude's Orphan train. The story is no longer a raw wound, but a polished piece of local identity, a myth that has defined the community's character for generations. The accepted truth of the flood is as solid and unmovable as the Kansas bedrock upon which the town was built. On the outskirts of town, the once grand Kane estate stands as a skeletal ruin. For decades it was a symbol of power and legacy, the ancestral home of Prosperity's founding family. Now, condemned by the state as structurally unsound, it is slated for demolition. A crew of workers moves through the decaying mansion with practiced indifference, their task being to erase a piece of history, not to uncover it. The air is thick with the dust of forgotten decades and the screech of stressed metal, the sounds of an old world being torn down. The work is methodical and brutal. Walls are brought down with sledgehammers, revealing the lath and plaster guts of the old house. It is during the demolition of the main parlor's immense stone fireplace that the rhythm of destruction is broken. A worker's hammer, meant to shatter stone, strikes something with a dull, metallic thud. The vibration that travels up the handle is all wrong. It is not the sound of rock or brick, but of solid, unyielding steel hidden deep within the chimney's foundation. Curiosity piqued, the foreman calls a halt to the work. Using crowbars and heavy tools, the crew chips away at the surrounding masonry, slowly revealing the source of the noise. Behind a layer of carefully placed fire bricks, they find a welded steel plate seamlessly integrated into the structure. It is not a repair, it is a seal, a deliberate and permanent concealment. This was not a space meant to be accessed, but a tomb designed never to be opened. The discovery transforms the mundane demolition into a site of profound mystery. With the grinding shriek of metal on metal, they manage to pry the plate from its century-old resting place. The opening reveals a small, dark cavity, meticulously lined with lead. Inside, resting on a bed of what was once velvet, sits a single object, a small, leather-bound diary. It is remarkably well preserved, the lead lining having protected it from the ravages of time, moisture, and decay. The foreman, a man raised on the town's legends, immediately recognizes the potential significance of such a find and makes the call. That call travels across state lines to Dr. Alistair Finch, a historian whose name is synonymous with the orphan train movement. Finch is a man of meticulous detail and academic rigor, but for 30 years the St. Jude's train has been his personal obsession. It is the one case that defies all logic, the one historical anomaly that feels incomplete. To him, the official story of the flood always seemed too simple, too neat a conclusion for the utter disappearance of a 70-ton locomotive and its precious cargo. When he receives the news of a diary found in the Kane estate, his initial reaction is one of guarded, professional skepticism. Hoaxes and forgeries have appeared before, crude attempts to capitalize on the enduring myth. Yet the circumstances of this discovery, hidden within a sealed, lead-lined compartment, suggest something far more genuine. A lifetime of chasing historical ghosts has taught him to manage his expectations, but a spark of profound excitement, an academic's thrill of the hunt, ignites within him. He agrees to come to Prosperity immediately. Upon his arrival, Alistair is escorted to the town's small historical society, where the diary awaits him under a glass case. The air in the room is thick with anticipation. The town council and members of the Kane family's latest generation are present, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. For them, this is a local artifact. For Alistair, it is potentially the key to a mystery that has haunted his entire professional life. He feels the weight of 100 years of silence pressing down on him. With gloved hands, he carefully lifts the diary. The leather is cool and supple, the paper inside crisp and showing little sign of age. The moment he examines the elegant looping script on the first page, his professional skepticism evaporates, replaced by an awestruck certainty. The handwriting, the type of ink, the very construction of the book, it is all consistent with the early 20th century. This is no forgery. This is the authentic handwritten account of a direct witness to the final journey of the St. Jude's train. He begins to read, and the voice of Sister Agnes emerges from the past, clear and full of hope. The initial entries are exactly what he would have expected. She writes of the children with a tender, maternal affection, capturing their personalities in brief, poignant sketches. She describes their dreams of new families, their laughter echoing through the train cars, and their wide-eyed wonder at the vast, unending plains. The diary is, at first, a beautiful and heartbreaking testament to the promise that was lost. Finch finds himself lost in her narrative, the children ceasing to be a mere statistic and becoming living, breathing individuals through her words. He reads the name of a young boy named Samuel, who was determined to become a cowboy, and of two sisters, Clara and Rose, who clutched the same worn doll and refused to be separated. Sister Agnes's prose paints a vivid picture of a vessel filled not with orphans, but with a resilient, makeshift family on the cusp of a new life. The entries chronicle their journey westward with a near-daily precision. The train's progress, the towns they passed, the changing landscapes. It is all there. Then comes the final entry before the train's scheduled stop in Prosperity. Sister Agnes writes of the town's founder, Jedediah Kane, with admiration, describing him as a great benefactor who has generously offered to resupply their train for the final leg of its journey. The tone is one of gratitude and optimism, with no hint of impending doom. For a moment, Alistair feels a pang of disappointment. Perhaps the diary will only serve to add a layer of personal tragedy to the accepted story, confirming the official narrative of the flood. He reads the last line on the page, dated the evening the train was last sighted. It ends with a simple prayer for a safe passage through the coming storm. He turns the page, expecting it to be the last, but finds another entry waiting for him. The date at the top of the new page makes his blood run cold. It is dated 2 full days after. The train was officially declared lost to the flood. The handwriting is almost unrecognizable. The graceful, controlled script has been replaced by a frantic, jagged scrawl. The ink is smeared and blotted, the words seemingly carved into the page by a hand trembling with terror and despair. This was not an entry written in quiet reflection. It was a desperate message scrawled in darkness. Alistair leans closer, his breath catching in his throat as he deciphers the first sentence. The words seem to leap off the page, shattering a century of accepted history in a single, devastating blow. The storm was a gift to him, Sister Agnes wrote, a perfect excuse. The bridge did not take us. The river was not our grave. The flood was a lie. The statement is so absolute, so contradictory to everything known, that it feels like a physical impact. The diary entry continues, a torrent of horrified recollection. Sister Agnes describes the train being deliberately switched onto the private spur line leading to the Kane silver mine. It was not a logistical decision, but a carefully orchestrated diversion. She writes of the train shuddering to a halt, not in a station, but in a desolate, isolated ravine, miles from town, where a group of men carrying rifles and the emblem of the Kane Mining Company were waiting for them. With cold, dispassionate clarity, she recounts how the armed men boarded the train. There was no negotiation, no explanation. The children's initial confusion quickly turned to terror as they were separated from their caretakers. The nuns and other guardians were forced into a single car under guard, while the children were herded out into the rain-swept darkness, their cries echoing against the canyon walls. The entire operation was executed with a chilling, military-like precision that spoke of meticulous planning. Her account grows more desperate as she describes being marched from the train, not toward the lights of prosperity, but toward the gaping black maw of the silver mine entrance. She writes of the cold, damp air and the smell of wet earth and blasting powder. The children, terrified and crying, were forced into the main shaft, their small figures swallowed by the immense darkness. It was not a rescue operation, it was a procession into the underworld, orchestrated by the very man hailed as the town's savior. The final sentences of the diary are nearly illegible, a testament to the absolute terror of her last moments. Sister Agnes describes being shoved into a small dark side tunnel away from the children. She could still hear their frightened sobs from the main cavern when a massive steel door, one she hadn't seen in the darkness, was slammed shut and bolted from the outside. Her last recorded words are not of herself, but for her charges. He has sealed us in. God, remember their names. The diary ends there. The rest of the pages are blank. Alistair Finch slowly closes the book, his hands trembling. The silence in the room is absolute, broken only by the sound of his own ragged breathing. He looks up at the faces of the town council members and the Kane descendants, their expressions of mild curiosity, now frozen into masks of disbelief and horror. The artifact they had unearthed was not a historical curiosity. It was a witness statement. The document in his hands did more than just offer a new perspective. It completely incinerated the official record. The St. Jude's Orphan train had not been the victim of a natural disaster. It had been hijacked. The 77 children and their caretakers had not been swept away by a flooded river. They had been deliberately taken, imprisoned, and left to die in the suffocating darkness of Jedediah Kane's silver mine. The town's founding myth, its century of noble grief, was all built upon a monstrous deception. The stone angel in the town square was not a memorial to a tragedy. It was a monument to a cover-up, a silent, unknowing accomplice to a crime of unimaginable cruelty. The entire history of prosperity and the celebrated legacy of the Kane family was now revealed to be a carefully constructed lie, hiding a foundation of horror. Dr. Finch understands in that instant that his role has irrevocably changed. He is no longer just a historian studying a cold case. He is now the primary witness in the reopening of a 100-year-old mass kidnapping and mass murder investigation. The diary of Sister Agnes has provided the first horrifying chapter of the truth. His task now is to uncover the rest of the story and find out why. The question of who benefited from the train's disappearance, once a matter of abstract speculation, now has a single, chilling answer: Jedediah Kane. But the how and the why remain buried. Why would a man of his stature and wealth orchestrate such a monstrous act? What purpose could 77 children serve by being imprisoned deep within a silver mine? The questions were as dark and deep as the mine itself. The discovery of the diary was not an end, but a beginning. It was the irrefutable evidence needed to shatter a century of silence and force a reckoning. The case of the lost orphan train was officially no longer a historical tragedy. It was now an active investigation, and the primary suspect was the sainted founder of prosperity himself. Alistair knew the path forward would be met with fierce resistance from those who had a vested interest in keeping the past buried. He looks again at the diary, the proof trophy that changes everything. It is a voice from the grave, a testament that has waited 100 years to be heard. Its words demand justice, not just for Sister Agnes, but for the 77 innocent children whose names had been erased and whose fates had been so cruelly rewritten. The town of Prosperity was about to be forced to confront the monster upon whose bones their homes were truly built. The official narrative had been refuted in the most categorical way imaginable. The accidental tragedy was now a meticulously planned crime. The act of God was revealed to be an act of pure, calculated human evil. The search for the children could no longer be confined to dredging the Cimarron River. It now had to turn toward the abandoned, dynamited mines that dotted the Kane family's ancestral lands. Alistair Finch, the quiet academic, has become the reluctant champion for the dead. He holds the truth in his hands, a truth that will tear the town of Prosperity apart before it can heal. The weight of this responsibility is immense, but his course is clear. He must follow the path Sister Agnes laid out, descending into the darkness she described to bring the full, horrifying story into the light, no matter the cost. The melancholy mystery of the lost train has been transformed into a hunt for a mass grave. The search for answers now has a clear, terrifying direction, pointing toward the sealed earth just a few miles from where they all stand. The town's carefully polished history is about to be shattered, and the ghosts of the St. Jude's children, silent for so long, are finally beginning to speak. The immediate aftermath of the diary's authentication sent a shockwave through Prosperity. The town, which had built its identity on a foundation of shared noble grief, was now forced to confront a narrative that painted its founder not as a patriarch, but as a monster. The initial reaction was a fierce collective denial. The Kane family, now led by Jedediah's formidable great-granddaughter Eleanor Vance, issued a formal statement dismissing the diary as a cruel and elaborate hoax, a sensationalist fabrication designed to tarnish a legacy of civic virtue and progress. They portrayed Dr. Alistair Finch not as a historian seeking truth, but as a grave robber of reputation, motivated by academic vanity. Eleanor Vance became the public face of this resistance. A woman of immense wealth and influence, she wielded her family's century-old power with surgical precision. To the people of Prosperity, she was the living embodiment of the Kane legacy, poised, powerful, and fiercely protective of the town's founding myth. She appeared in televised interviews, her demeanor a carefully calibrated mix of sorrow and indignation, framing Finch's investigation as an attack on the very soul of their community. She argued that to question Jedediah Kane was to question the legitimacy of Prosperity itself, a sentiment that resonated deeply with a town accustomed to its quiet, orderly history. But Alistair Finch was undeterred. The desperate, terrified scrawl of Sister Agnes's final entry had transformed him. He was no longer a dispassionate academic chasing a historical footnote. He was the sole advocate for 77 silenced children. He established a small, makeshift headquarters in a rented office off Prosperity's main square, the stone angel of the false memorial visible from his window. From this humble command center, surrounded by maps, historical documents, and digital copies of the diary, he began the monumental task of systematically dismantling a lie that had stood for 100 years. His first official act was to petition the state attorney general's office, presenting the diary as new evidence in a century-old cold case. He requested two things: a court order to unseal the entirety of the Kane Mining Company's corporate archives from 1911 to 1915, and a warrant to conduct a full geological and archaeological survey of the land surrounding the old dynamited mine entrance. Eleanor Vance's legal team responded immediately, filing a barrage of injunctions to block his requests, citing privacy, protection of private property, and the historical preservation of their ancestral land. The battle for the truth would first be fought in a courtroom. As the legal gears began to grind, the story of the diary exploded onto the national stage. News vans with satellite dishes descended upon Prosperity, their crews broadcasting live from the town square. The narrative was irresistible. A lost orphan train, a hidden diary, a sainted town founder accused of a monstrous crime. The town found itself under an intense and unwelcome microscope. Every resident was now a potential interview, every whispered opinion a potential soundbite. The pressure cooker environment began to expose the deep fissures in the community, pitting longtime neighbors against one another in a conflict between cherished myth and dawning horror. Finch's investigative strategy was methodical, beginning with the cornerstone of the official story, the storm. Was it truly the act of God that the 1911 inquiry had declared it to be? He assembled a team of historical climatologists and forensic meteorologists to re-examine the atmospheric data from that fateful night. They fed century-old weather reports, barometric pressure readings, and eyewitness accounts from surrounding counties into sophisticated modern computer models. Their goal was to digitally reconstruct the storm and determine its true magnitude, separating fact from the folklore that had amplified its power over the decades. The results were damning. While the simulation confirmed a severe thunderstorm with heavy rainfall, it was far from the apocalyptic, landscape-altering cataclysm of legend. The models showed the Cimarron River would have flooded, but its peak level was several feet below what would have been necessary to completely obliterate a 150-ton railway bridge built to withstand significant hydrological stress. The storm was a powerful event, certainly, but it was not the impossibly destructive force required to make a 70-ton locomotive and its 7 cars simply vanish. The perfect storm was, in fact, the perfect cover story. Armed with this data, Finch turned to the only known physical evidence from the original investigation, a handful of grainy, black-and-white photographs of the destroyed railway bridge taken by a local photographer in the days after the flood. He had these images digitized at an extremely high resolution and subjected them to structural analysis by a forensic engineering firm. The experts examining the magnified images noticed something the 1911 investigators had missed entirely. The fracture patterns on the remaining timber pylons were clean and angular, inconsistent with the splintering and tearing caused by the sheer force of rushing water. The engineering report was unequivocal. The damage to the bridge's support structure was not the result of erosion or hydraulic pressure. Instead, the patterns were consistent with deliberate sabotage, specifically the use of cutting charges placed at key structural weak points. The conclusion was chilling. The bridge hadn't been washed away, it had been intentionally destroyed. The storm and the subsequent flood had been used to conceal an act of calculated destruction, ensuring that when search parties arrived, they would find exactly what they were supposed to find: a plausible, tragic accident that required no further investigation. If the bridge was deliberately sabotaged to create a false narrative, who possessed the capability and the motive to execute such a complex plan? The question pointed in only one direction. The operation would have required a coordinated team, access to explosives, and intimate knowledge of the railway network. Jedediah Kane, with his private spur line, his crew of mine blasters, and his own company security force, was the only individual in the entire region with the resources to divert a train and simultaneously demolish a bridge miles away, all under the cover of a single storm. Finch's legal team presented the meteorological and engineering reports to the court, and the judge, faced with compelling scientific evidence of a cover-up, granted a partial victory. Finch was given access to all of Prosperity's public municipal and railway records from the era, though the private Kane archives remained sealed pending further hearings. It was a crucial first step. Finch now had the chance to cross-reference Sister Agnes's account with the town's own official paper trail, hunting for the inconsistencies that he knew must be there, hidden in plain sight, for a century. He started with the railway dispatch logs for the night of the disappearance. He found the official entry noting the St. Jude's train being switched to the Kane mining spur. The reason cited in the log was emergency track maintenance on the main line ahead. However, a meticulous search of all railway maintenance records for the following month showed no such work was ever performed or even scheduled. The emergency was a fabrication, a lie entered into the official record to justify the train's fatal diversion. It was the first black and white proof of a deliberate, premeditated act. Next, Finch turned his attention to Prosperity's employment and census records. In the 2 weeks leading up to the train's arrival, he discovered that the Kane Mining Company had hired 28 new men, all listed as security consultants. Their records showed they were not local, and their previous employment histories, where listed, were exclusively in law enforcement or the military. These were not miners. They were a private army, hired for a specific, short-term operation. What kind of mining operation required such a force? A deeper dive into the town's records revealed that every single one of these men was dismissed from Kane's employment within a week of the train's disappearance. They were paid a substantial bonus, far exceeding their short tenure, and then they vanished. Finch's team attempted to trace them through national archives, but the trails went cold almost immediately. It was clear they were hired guns, brought in to perform a single task and then paid to disappear forever, taking the secret of what they had done with them. The town's financial ledgers provided another critical piece of the puzzle. In the 6 months before the train vanished, Jedediah Kane made a series of enormous purchases, all classified under mine development. The expenditures seemed nonsensical for a silver mine that was, by all public accounts, still in its exploratory phase and not yet producing any significant ore. He was spending a fortune on a venture that had yet to yield a single dollar of profit, a move that would have been seen as reckless by any rational industrialist. Finch painstakingly tracked down the original shipping manifests for these purchases from suppliers in St. Louis and Chicago. The cargo lists were revealing. Kane had not been buying drills, pickaxes, or ore carts. He had purchased a massive, industrial-grade air ventilation system, hundreds of military surplus cots, and several tons of non-perishable foodstuffs like canned goods and salted meat. Most chillingly, one manifest detailed the delivery of a custom-forged, reinforced steel door, with dimensions matching that of a main mine shaft entrance. He wasn't building a mine, he was building a subterranean prison. While the paper trail grew, Finch sought out living connections to the past. He located the 98-year-old granddaughter of Marcus Thorne, the man who had been Prosperity's town sheriff in 1911. Her memory was frail, but one story her grandfather told her had remained vivid. During the search for the train, Sheriff Thorne and his deputy had attempted to follow the spur line onto Kane's property. They were met at the property line by a group of armed men, Kane's new security force, who denied them entry, stating the area was too dangerous due to flash flooding. This testimony, though anecdotal, was a powerful corroboration of the growing evidence. The official search for the train had been deliberately and illegally obstructed. Kane had used his authority and his private army to create a cordon around the mine, ensuring the search parties focused exclusively on the Cimarron River and the sabotaged bridge. He had controlled the entire narrative from the very beginning, guiding the eyes of the world toward a tragedy of his own invention, while the real horror was unfolding just a few miles away in the dark. With this, the horrifying why of the conspiracy began to crystallize in Finch's mind. Kane hadn't just murdered 77 children. The elaborate preparations, the ventilation system, the food, the cots, suggested a far more sinister and prolonged purpose. He must have known the silver veins in his mind were too narrow and unstable for traditional adult miners. But they were not too small for children. What if he saw the Orphan train not as a human convoy, but as a delivery of an undocumented, untraceable, and completely expendable workforce? The hypothesis was monstrous, almost unthinkable in its cruelty. Jedediah Kane, the celebrated philanthropist, had orchestrated the disappearance of a train full of children to enslave them. He had planned to work them to death in the dangerous depths of his mine, extracting the silver that would build his fortune and the town that bore his name. The elaborate cover-up was not just to hide a mass murder, but to conceal an ongoing atrocity. The children were not meant to die in the river, they were meant to die in his service, deep beneath the earth. Armed with this comprehensive body of evidence, meteorological, financial, and anecdotal, Finch's legal team returned to court. They argued that the Kane property was not just the site of a historical mine, but the location of a century-old mass grave and a crime scene that had been actively concealed. The judge, presented with the overwhelming pattern of deceit and obstruction, finally agreed. He signed the court order granting Finch's team full authority to conduct a forensic excavation of the dynamited mine entrance. Eleanor Vance's legal challenges had failed. The news of the impending excavation split Prosperity in two. The town square became a daily theater of conflict, with vigils for the lost children held on one side and protests defending the Kane family's honor on the other. Eleanor Vance retreated from the public eye, issuing one final defiant statement, condemning the court's decision as a grotesque desecration based on the fantasies of a discredited historian. The composed mask of the powerful matriarch was beginning to crack, revealing the desperation of someone watching their entire world crumble. Finch's team began using ground-penetrating radar, GPR, to map the subterranean landscape beneath the dynamited entrance. The technology, which was unimaginable in 1911, sent electromagnetic pulses deep into the earth, creating a digital image of what lay beneath. The initial scans were stunning. They revealed the clear outline of the original mine shaft, but they also showed a large anomalous metallic signature at a depth of 30 feet, exactly where the entrance should be. It was a solid non-geological object, consistent in size and shape with a massive steel door. The GPR also detected a series of large, interconnected caverns branching off the main shaft. These were not the narrow tunnels of a typical silver mine. They appeared to have been deliberately widened, forming large chamber-like spaces. This finding was consistent with Finch's hypothesis that the mine was intended to house people, not just to extract ore. The digital ghosts of the radar screen were providing the first glimpse of the children's prison and, ultimately, their tomb. As the GPR team worked, another piece of the puzzle fell into place from Sister Agnes's diary. She had mentioned a silent bell in one of her earlier hopeful entries, noting a small mission chapel funded by Kane on a hill overlooking the town. Finch found the mission on old maps, located less than a mile from the mine entrance. Town records showed it was decommissioned and demolished in the 1940s for safety reasons. The bell, a gift from Kane himself, was noted as having been lost during the demolition. An archivist digging through old town newsletters found a short article from the week of the storm. It mentioned several residents reporting the mission bell ringing erratically on the night the train disappeared, a detail that was dismissed at the time as the wind or a prank. But to Finch, it was no prank. What if the bell, visible from the railway spur, was a signal? A signal to Kane's men on the ground that the train was approaching and the operation was to begin. The silent bell had not been silent at all. It had been the starting gun. The mounting evidence created an atmosphere of unbearable tension in Prosperity. The Kane family's reputation was in tatters. During one of her final strained television appearances, Eleanor Vance made a critical error. When pressed by a reporter about the diary, she snapped, "My great-grandfather had nothing to do with that tragedy at the mine," before immediately correcting herself. "At the river." It was a Freudian slip, a momentary crack in the century-old facade, but it was broadcast across the nation. Had the family known the truth all along? The slip of the tongue prompted Finch to dig into the Kane family's private history. He discovered that Jedediah's only son, Robert, who was a teenager in 1911, was abruptly sent to a private boarding school in Switzerland less than a month after the train vanished. Family correspondence from the time referred to Robert suffering a sudden and severe nervous affliction. He never returned to Prosperity, spending the rest of his life in a succession of private European sanatoriums. What could a teenage boy have seen or heard that would warrant a lifetime of exile? The implication was profound. Robert Kane may have been a witness, his conscience broken by the weight of his father's secret. While his medical records were sealed, the timeline of his institutionalization was a silent testament to a secret so terrible it had to be buried not just in a mine, but in the mind of the founder's own son. The conspiracy of silence was not just a public construct, it was an intimate family burden passed down through generations. With the GPR data confirming a sealed, man-made structure and the circumstantial evidence becoming an avalanche, the day of the excavation finally arrived. A perimeter was established around the old mine, turning the quiet patch of Kansas prairie into a major forensic operation, complete with heavy machinery, mobile command centers, and a swarm of law enforcement officials. The world's media watched from a distance, their cameras trained on the patch of earth that held one of the nation's darkest secrets. The work of removing the tons of rock and soil that had covered the entrance for nearly a century was painstakingly slow. Engineers directed the excavation, ensuring the integrity of the surrounding hillside to prevent a collapse that could destroy whatever evidence lay within. Each bucket of earth removed felt like peeling back a layer of time, getting closer and closer to the heart of the crime. Finch stood at the edge of the site, a silent sentinel, feeling the profound weight of the moment. He was there to bear witness for those who could not. After 4 days of continuous digging, the excavator's bucket scraped against something that was not rock. A loud metallic screech echoed across the site, and work immediately halted. The team moved in with hand tools, carefully clearing away the remaining dirt and debris. Slowly, a vast expanse of dark, rusted metal was revealed. It was the top of the steel door, pockmarked and corroded by a century of moisture, but still undeniably intact. It was exactly as Sister Agnes had described it, a final, unyielding barrier between the world and Cain's secret. The door was a monstrous artifact. Forensic metallurgists, examining its surface, found crude but powerful welding marks along its edges, confirming it had been sealed shut from the outside. It was not a safety measure designed to be reopened. It was a permanent entombment. This was not a mine that had been closed. It was a tomb that had been created. The sight of it silenced the entire crew, the physical reality of the crime more powerful than any document or theory. The team began preparations to breach the seal. They brought in specialized plasma cutters, the modern tools of entry arrayed against the century-old barrier. The air grew thick with a mixture of dread and anticipation. What horrors had been preserved in the oxygen-deprived darkness behind that door? What would 100 years of silence look like? For Finch, this was the culmination of his life's work, the moment the voice from a diary would be met with the cold, hard evidence of the crime it described. Eleanor Vance and the remaining members of the Cain family were nowhere to be seen, having barricaded themselves within the modern mansion that had replaced the original estate. Their silence was its own kind of confession. The legacy they had fought so hard to protect was now being measured by the thickness of a rusted steel door. Their name, once synonymous with prosperity, was about to become a byword for an evil of an almost unimaginable scale. The site commander gave the order. The plasma torch ignited with a fierce hiss, casting a brilliant, almost blinding white light against the dark red of the rusted steel. The flame, burning at thousands of degrees, began to slowly, deliberately slice through the metal. A thin, glowing orange line started to trace a path across the door, the first opening in the tomb in 100 years. Every person present held their breath, knowing that what lay beyond that door was not just history, but a judgment. The high-pitched scream of the torch cutting through steel was the only sound, a final violent shriek tearing through a century of enforced silence. They were no longer just digging into the earth. They were cutting into the heart of a monstrous lie, preparing to expose the bones upon which the town of Prosperity had truly been built. The truth of the St. Jude's orphan train was only inches away. The plasma torch cut the final inch of steel with a piercing shriek, and a century of darkness was broken. As the severed section of the door was pulled away, a wave of cold, stale air washed over the assembled team, an exhalation from a tomb. It carried the scent of deep earth, damp stone, and something else, an indescribable odor of profound stillness and decay. The first beam of light sliced into the blackness, illuminating a cavern far larger than any mine blueprint had ever suggested. It was a cathedral of silence, a place where time itself had been frozen, waiting for this exact moment of violent interruption. A specialized forensic team, clad in protective gear, was the first to enter. Their powerful lights cut through the oppressive gloom, revealing the cavern's true nature. This was no simple mine shaft. The walls had been crudely but deliberately widened, and the floor leveled. Along one wall stretching into the darkness were dozens of small rusted metal frames, the skeletal remains of military surplus cots. They were arranged in neat, orderly rows like a subterranean barracks. It was the first chilling confirmation that this place had been built not for work but for habitation, a prison designed to hold a small, captive population. As the team moved deeper, The artifacts of a stolen childhood began to appear, preserved in the oxygen-poor environment. A small worn leather shoe lay on its side, its laces still tied. A tarnished silver locket rested near a pile of rocks, its chain broken. In a small alcove, propped against the stone wall, was a rag doll with button eyes, its fabric stiff with age and moisture. Each object was a silent, heartbreaking testament to an individual life, a stark refutation of the anonymous tragedy that history had recorded. Dr. Alistair Finch watched on a monitor from the command post, his throat tight, as the ghosts of the St. Jude's train began to take shape. Then came the discovery that silenced the entire operation. In a side tunnel, partially hidden by a rockfall that must have occurred years after the initial sealing, the team found the first of the remains. They were small skeletons clustered together as if for comfort in their final moments. Around the fragile neck bones of one, a small silver medallion glinted in the harsh forensic lights. It was the emblem of the St. Jude's orphanage. There was no longer any room for doubt or interpretation. This was not just a mine. It was a mass grave, the final horrifying destination of the 77 missing children. The search intensified, each new discovery adding another layer to the atrocity. The remains were found throughout the main cavern and its branching tunnels, some in the crude sleeping quarters, others near collapsed sections of the mine where they had likely been working. The evidence painted a clear and sickening picture. The children had been forced to live and labor in this abyss, their small bodies used to navigate the narrow, unstable silver seams that an adult miner could never reach. They were not just murdered. They had been enslaved and worked to death, their lives consumed by Jedediah Kane's insatiable greed. At the farthest end of the main cavern, the team found something unexpected. A solid oak door, reinforced with iron bands, set directly into the rock face. Unlike everything else, it was remarkably preserved, sealed from the elements. It was locked from the outside with a heavy rusted bolt. This was not part of any known mining plan. It was a private sanctum, a place of authority within the larger prison. With carefully applied force, the team broke the lock and swung the heavy door inward, revealing a room that had not been seen by human eyes in 100 years. It was an office, carved from the stone. A heavy wooden desk and chair sat in the center, covered in a thick blanket of dust. On the wall, geological maps of the silver veins were pinned next to meticulous architectural drawings for the mine's ventilation system. It was the nerve center of the entire horrific operation, the place from which Jedediah Kane had overseen his secret empire built on the suffering of children. Alistair Finch, now inside the mine, felt a cold dread as he approached the desk. He knew with an absolute certainty that the final piece of the puzzle was here. On the desk, next to a dried-up inkwell, was a small ornate key. A brief search revealed its purpose. A large iron safe, bolted to the cavern's rock wall and hidden behind a false panel. The key slid into the lock with a faint click. As the heavy door swung open, it revealed not gold or silver, but a single object resting on a velvet shelf. A thick leather-bound ledger. Its cover was embossed with the initials J.K. This was it. The proof trophy. The confession that had waited a century to be read. Alistair Finch, his hands trembling beneath his gloves, carefully lifted the ledger and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was cold, precise, and utterly devoid of emotion. It was the unmistakable script of Jedediah Kane. But this was no financial record of ore production. It was a human inventory. The first entry read, Asset acquisition complete, October 12, 1911. Unit count, 77 operational. The children of the St. Jude's train had been dehumanized into assets, their arrival logged like a shipment of goods, their names erased and replaced with numbers. He turned the pages, each one a new descent into a calculated hell. Kane had cataloged the children by age and perceived strength, assigning them to different tasks within the mine. He recorded their meager food rations, the number of hours they worked, and the weight of the ore they extracted. The entries were chilling in their bureaucratic detachment. He referred to cave-ins not as tragedies, but as workforce attrition events. The death of a child from sickness or exhaustion was noted as a unit failure, followed by a cold calculation of the resulting loss in productivity. The motive hinted at in the financial records was now laid bare in Kane's own monstrous words. The silver veins were rich but dangerously unstable and too narrow for adult men to work effectively. The orphans were his solution, an undocumented, untraceable, and completely expendable labor force. He had seen the train not as a vessel of hope, but as a delivery of human tools. In his own mind he was not a murderer, but a pragmatic industrialist, solving a logistical problem with ruthless efficiency. The ledger was a complete record of his crime and a window into the profound darkness of his soul. The news of the ledger's discovery was the final devastating blow to the Kane legacy. The contents were leaked to the press, and the world was confronted with Jedediah Kane's own handwritten confession. His carefully constructed image as a benevolent patriarch was incinerated, replaced by the reality of a monster who had built his fortune on the bones of children. The town of prosperity, named for the wealth he had extracted, was now forced to reckon with the true cost of its founding. Dr. Finch, carrying the original ledger in a secure case, did not go to the authorities first. He drove through the media circus to the modern Kane mansion, where Eleanor Vance had remained secluded. He was met at the door by her lawyers, but he refused to speak with them. He would only speak to her. After a tense standoff, the doors opened. Eleanor stood at the top of a grand staircase, her face a pale-drawn mask of defiance, the last defender of a fallen kingdom. They met in the mansion's library, a room filled with leather-bound books and portraits of Kane ancestors. The air was thick with the weight of unspoken history. Alistair did not raise his voice. He simply placed the ledger on the polished mahogany table between them. "I believe this belongs to your family," he said, his voice quiet but heavy with the gravity of the moment. He opened it to a specific page, a date 2 years after the train's disappearance, and turned it for her to see. The entry was the last one in the book. It detailed the decommissioning of the final unit, a 16-year-old boy who had survived the longest. Kane noted the mine's silver vein was exhausted, and the operation was no longer profitable. The final sentence read, "Project concluded. Total asset expenditure justified by yield. Seal the entrance." Alistair watched as Eleanor's eyes scanned the words, her carefully maintained composure finally beginning to fracture. The clinical, inhuman cruelty of her great-grandfather's accounting was undeniable. "He was a great man," she whispered, the words sounding hollow even to herself. "He built this town. He gave people hope." It was the last gasp of the family myth, a final desperate attempt to cling to the lie. Alistair slowly shook his head. "He built it on a graveyard," he replied, his voice firm. "He didn't give hope. He stole it from 77 children who had nothing else. Their names were Samuel and Clara and Rose, and he erased them for profit." At the mention of the names, something inside Eleanor Vance finally broke. A strangled sob escaped her lips, and the mask of the powerful matriarch crumbled, revealing a woman crushed by the weight of a secret she had inherited. "We knew," she confessed, her voice cracking. "Not the details, not this horror. But we knew something was wrong. There were whispers, stories passed down. My grandfather spoke of his father's great burden. We were told to never ask, to never dig. We were told the family's survival depended on the silence." Her confession, captured by the discreet recording device of a detective who had accompanied Finch, was the final act. It was an admission of a century of willful ignorance and active obstruction. The Kane family had not just benefited from the crime. They had been its silent, complicit guardians. The truth had been a poison in their bloodline, a secret so monstrous that each generation chose to pass it on rather than face it, perpetuating the lie that had defined their existence and their town. The legal and social fallout was immediate and absolute. Based on the Ledger and Eleanor's confession, the Kane family's assets were frozen. Courts would later rule that their entire fortune was the direct proceeds of a criminal enterprise to be seized and placed into a trust for historical preservation and victim restitution. The Kane name, once a symbol of prestige and power in Kansas, became a permanent mark of shame. The family that had ruled Prosperity for a century was ruined, their dynasty ending not with a bang, but with the quiet turning of a ledger's page. For the town of Prosperity, the revelation was a seismic event that forced a painful and necessary identity crisis. The founding myth was dead, and the community had to confront the monstrous truth at its heart. The process was agonizing, filled with grief, anger, and shame. But from the ashes of the lie, a new sense of purpose began to emerge, a collective responsibility to honor the true founders of their town, the children who had paid for it with their lives. Forensic genealogists began the painstaking work of identifying each child, using the St. Jude's medallions and advanced DNA analysis to trace their lineage. Miraculously, they found distant living relatives for more than half of the victims, great-nieces and nephews who had grown up with vague family stories of a child given up to an orphanage and lost to the West. For these families, the discovery brought a somber closure to a wound that had lingered, unspoken, for generations. A town-wide ceremony was held. The centerpiece of the event was the public demolition of the Stone Angel Memorial, the monument to Jedediah Kane's lie. As the statue fell, it felt like a collective exhalation, the final rejection of a history built on deceit. In its place, a new memorial was planned, one that would finally tell the true story. The entire town gathered in the square, and for the first time in 100 years, the names of all 77 children of the saint Jude's orphan train were read aloud, each name a reclamation of a stolen identity. Alistair Finch watched from the back of the crowd, the ledger now safely in the hands of the state archives. His work was done. He had given the children their names back, and in doing so, he had given them back their history. He thought of Sister Agnes, whose desperate, hurried words had been the spark that ignited this fire of truth. Her final scribbled prayer, God remember their names, had finally been answered, not by a deity, but by the relentless, methodical pursuit of historical fact. The old Kane mine was permanently sealed, its entrance encased in concrete. It was not dynamited to hide a secret, but consecrated as a historical site, a protected tomb. A simple bronze plaque was placed at the site, listing the names of the 77 victims. It did not mention Jedediah Kane. His name would be remembered only in the ledger that detailed his crimes, a permanent testament to the depths of his depravity, while the names of the children he tried to erase were carved in stone for all time. In the end, the story of the Prosperity Mine children became a powerful, albeit tragic, lesson. It served as a stark reminder that history is not always written by the victors, but sometimes by the witnesses, no matter how long their voices are silenced. The truth, like a body buried in shallow ground, has a way of rising to the surface. It may take a day, or a year, or a century, but it will not be contained forever, for some secrets are too heavy for the earth to hold.